Before watching, please press like to support me in producing more stories. This helps in spreading the video and reaching more people. Thank you for your support and enjoy watching. The date was July 25th, 1991. I remember it clearly because it was the day my life changed forever. My name's Henry, and I just finished a stint with the Coast Guard. After years of service, I was ready for some peace and quiet. That's why I chose a small cabin outside the little town of Oak Ridge, nestled in the backwoods of Oregon. The cabin itself wasn't much to look at, a weathered two-bedroom structure with a tin roof that sang in the rain and creaked under the weight of winter snow. But it was mine, and it came with 5 acres of densely wooded land that stretched out into the wilderness beyond. As I pulled up in my beat-up Ford pickup, loaded down with what few possessions I'd accumulated over the years, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. In the distance, I could hear the faint rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a bird I couldn't identify. "This is it," I muttered to myself, climbing out of the truck. Home sweet home. The realtor had left the key under a flower pot by the front door, just as she'd promised. As I turned it in the lock, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of excitement. This was my fresh start, my chance to leave behind the rigors of military life and find some peace. The inside of the cabin was modest but comfortable. A small living room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen with appliances that had seen better days but still worked, and 2 bedrooms, one of which I planned to use as a study. It wasn't much, but it was more than enough for a man who'd spent the better part of a decade bunking on Coast Guard cutters. That first night, as I lay in bed listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the forest, I felt truly at ease for the first time in years. The solitude that some might find oppressive was a balm to my soul. Little did I know that this peace was merely the calm before a storm that would shatter my world and challenge everything I thought I knew about reality. The next few weeks passed in a blur of unpacking, settling in, and getting to know the rhythms of life in the woods. I spent my days fixing up the cabin, chopping firewood, and exploring the surrounding forest. The solitude suited me just fine, even if it did get a tad lonely at times. It was about a month after I'd moved in that I noticed the first sign that something wasn't quite right. One morning, as I was heading out to the old woodshed to grab some kindling, I stumbled upon a gruesome sight that stopped me dead in my tracks. There, just a few yards from the shed, lay the mangled carcass of a rabbit. Now, I'd seen plenty of animal kills before. It was part and parcel of living in the woods. But this was different. The rabbit hadn't just been killed, it had been torn apart with a savagery that sent a chill down my spine. I crouched down to get a closer look, my stomach churning at the sight. The wounds didn't look like any coyote kill I'd ever seen. There were claw marks, sure, but they were bigger, deeper than anything I'd encountered in these parts before. "Must be a mountain lion passing through," I muttered to myself, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew something didn't add up. Mountain lion sightings were rare in this area, and they certainly didn't leave behind half a carcass like this. Whatever had done this wasn't hungry, it was killing for the sake of it. I buried the remains of the rabbit, unable to shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. That night, as I sat by the fireplace, my mind kept wandering back to the gruesome scene. For the first time since I'd moved in, the creaks and groans of the cabin and the rustling of the wind through the trees took on a more sinister tone. I tried to brush it off as paranoia, a holdover from my military days perhaps, but deep down, a part of me knew that something had changed. The peace I'd found in these woods suddenly felt fragile, like a thin veneer covering something dark and dangerous lurking just beneath the surface. Little did I know this was just the beginning. The true horror that awaited me in those Oregon backwoods was beyond anything I could have imagined. A few days after the rabbit incident, I heard the sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway. It was a welcome distraction from the unease that had been gnawing at me. As I stepped out onto the porch, I saw a battered blue pickup truck pulling up. A man in his late 50s with a weathered face and calloused hands climbed out. "You must be the new guy," he called out, his voice gruff but not unfriendly. "Name's Tom. My family's owned the property next door for generations." I walked down to meet him, extending my hand. "Henry, nice to meet you, Tom." We shook hands, his grip firm and calloused. Tom's eyes scanned the property, taking in the changes I'd made and the work still to be done. "Place is looking better," he nodded approvingly. "Old man Jenkins let it go to seed before he passed." We spent the next hour or so talking about typical small-town stuff. The upcoming deer season, the fishing tournament in Oak Ridge, the best places to get supplies. It was nice having a conversation with someone after weeks of solitude. But as Tom was getting ready to leave, his demeanor changed. The easygoing smile faded, replaced by a look of concern that made my stomach tighten. "Listen, Henry," he said, his voice low and serious. "There's something you should know. My brother Bill, he went missing up in the hills about a week ago. Was out on a hunting trip, knew these woods like the back of his hand, but he never came back." I felt a chill run down my spine, remembering the mangled rabbit carcass. "Any leads?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Tom shook his head, his eyes distant. "Nothing. Search parties combed the area for days, not a trace. It's like he just vanished." We stood there in silence for a moment, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. Without saying it explicitly, we both knew there was something out there in the woods that wasn't right. "Just be careful, all right?" Tom said finally, climbing back into his truck. "These woods, they can be dangerous if you don't know what you're doing." As I watched Tom's truck disappear down the dirt road, I couldn't shake the feeling that his warning went beyond the usual dangers of the wilderness. There was something else out there, something that had taken his brother and left that rabbit torn to shreds. That night I double-checked all the locks on the doors and windows. For the first time since moving in, I kept my Coast Guard-issued sidearm on the nightstand as I tried to sleep. The darkness outside seemed to press against the windows, and every sound from the forest took on a new, menacing quality. I lay awake for hours, my mind racing. What had happened to Tom's brother? Was it connected to what I'd seen? And most importantly, what else was out there in those woods, waiting in the shadows? The days that followed Tom's visit were filled with a tension I couldn't shake. I found myself constantly on edge, jumping at every unexpected sound. The peace I'd found in the solitude of the forest had been replaced by a gnawing anxiety that something was out there, watching and waiting. I started keeping my rifle loaded and close at hand, a habit I'd left behind with my Coast Guard days. Every morning I'd make a circuit of the property, checking the woodshed and the outlying areas for any signs of disturbance. More often than not, I'd find nothing, but sometimes, it was about a week after Tom's visit that I found the next sign. Another dead animal, this time a raccoon, torn apart in the same brutal fashion as the rabbit. The sight of it made my stomach churn, but what really set my nerves on edge were the tracks I found nearby. They were big, far too big for any animal native to these woods. And the shape was all wrong, vaguely humanoid, but distorted, with what looked like massive claws digging into the soft earth. I tried to tell myself it was just a bear, maybe one that was sick or injured, acting out of character, but deep down I knew I was lying to myself. That night, as I sat by the fireplace cleaning my rifle, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a howl, but unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It started low, almost subsonic, before rising to a pitch that set my teeth on edge. It wasn't a wolf, or a coyote, or any other animal I could identify. It was something else entirely. The howl echoed through the woods, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I sat there frozen, my hands shaking as I clutched my rifle. For a moment I seriously considered packing up and leaving, heading back to civilization and never looking back. But something kept me there. Maybe it was stubbornness, or a misplaced sense of duty. Or maybe deep down, a part of me needed to know what was out there, to confront the unknown that was slowly closing in around me. As the days wore on, the signs became more frequent, more brazen. More dead animals, always torn apart with the same savage fury. Tracks that seemed to circle the cabin, coming closer each time, and always that bone-chilling howl in the night, a sound that haunted my dreams and left me waking in a cold sweat. I found myself sleeping less and less, spending my nights sitting by the window, rifle in hand, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The forest that had once seemed so welcoming now felt like a prison, the trees closing in, hiding God knows what in their shadows. It was during one of these sleepless nights that I saw it for the first time. A flash of movement at the edge of the clearing, just barely visible in the pale moonlight. For a split second I caught a glimpse of something tall, hunched over on powerful legs, with matted fur that seemed to absorb the light around it. Then it was gone, vanishing back into the shadows before I could even raise my rifle. But that brief glimpse was enough to confirm my worst fears. There was something out there, something that defied explanation, and it was getting bolder. I knew then that things were coming to a head. Whatever this creature was, whatever game it was playing, it was escalating. And I had a sickening feeling that I was nearing the end of its twisted game. The night it all came to a head started like any other in those tense, fear-filled weeks. I was sitting in my usual spot by the window, rifle across my lap, straining my eyes to penetrate the darkness beyond the glass. The moon was just a sliver in the sky, casting barely enough light to see the edge of the clearing. It was around 2 a.m. when I heard it. A scratching sound from the roof, so faint at first I thought I might be imagining it. But then it came again, louder this time, followed by a low, guttural growl that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My hands tightened on the rifle as I slowly stood up, every muscle in my body tense. The scratching continued, moving across the roof towards the back of the cabin. Whatever it was trying to find a way in. Suddenly there was a loud thump from the front porch, like something heavy landing on the wooden planks. The front door shuddered in its frame as something slammed against it. The barricade I'd hastily constructed held, but I knew it wouldn't last forever. Heart pounding, I backed away from the window, trying to keep all the possible entry points in view. The windows were next. I heard the splintering of wood from the back room as something tore at the boards I'd nailed over the glass. There was no time to think, only to act. I grabbed my go bag, a duffel filled with supplies I'd prepared for just such an emergency, and made a dash for the cellar door. This old place had a storm shelter, a relic from the previous owners that I'd never been more grateful for than at that moment. I barely got the heavy metal door shut behind me when I heard the sound of glass shattering upstairs. The creature was in the cabin. I huddled there in the musty, damp darkness of the cellar, my rifle clutched to my chest, listening to the sounds of destruction above. The screams were the worst part, not mine. I was too terrified to make a sound, but high-pitched, desperate screams that I realized with a sickening jolt were coming from the rabbits in the yard. The creature was hunting, tearing through anything alive it could find. Then, abruptly, silence fell. A silence somehow more terrifying than the chaos that had preceded it. Each passing minute was agony as I strained my ears for any sound, any clue as to what was happening above. I don't know how long I stayed there, huddled in that dank cellar. It might have been an hour, it might have been 3. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the oppressive darkness. Eventually I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was out there. With trembling hands I reached for the cellar door, my other hand white-knuckled around the grip of my rifle. Slowly, agonizingly, I pushed the door open just a crack, peering out into the cabin above. The first rays of dawn were breaking through the shattered windows, casting long shadows across the devastation. The cabin was a wreck, furniture overturned, claw marks scoring the walls. But it was empty. Whatever had attacked during the night was gone. Cautiously I emerged from the cellar, my eyes darting to every shadow, every dark corner. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the pounding of my own heart. As I made my way through the ruined cabin, a glint of something caught my eye. There, amidst the debris near the front door, was a patch of fabric. As I drew closer, my blood ran cold. I recognized those boots, that jacket. It was Tom's brother, or what was left of him. The only reason I could identify him was by his clothing. The rest, it was like someone had taken him apart and put him back together wrong. I stumbled back, fighting the urge to vomit. This couldn't be real. It had to be a nightmare. But the acrid smell of blood and the cool morning air on my skin told me this was all too real. As I stood there trying to process what I was seeing, a flash of movement from outside caught my eye. Slowly, dreading what I might see, I turned towards the old oak tree by the creek. And there it was. The creature crouched in the lower branches watching me. In the growing light of dawn I could see it clearly for the first time. It was tall, easily 7 feet or more, with a body covered in dark matted fur. But it wasn't the size that chilled me to the bone. It was the face. For a brief moment, as the sunlight caught a patch of its fur, I saw what looked like a human face tangled in the matted hair. A face contorted in rage and pain, with eyes that burned with an intelligence that was terrifyingly human. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. It knew I had seen it, knew its game was up. Slowly, deliberately, it turned and slunk back into the shadows of the forest, disappearing as if it had never been there at all. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my mind reeling from what I'd just witnessed. The silence of the morning was broken only by the sound of birds cautiously beginning their songs, as if testing whether it was safe to do so. When I finally found the strength to move, I stumbled outside and vomited where the grass met the trees. The reality of what had happened, of what I'd seen, came crashing down on me. Tom's family deserved to know what had happened to his brother, even if they wouldn't believe a word I said about the creature. As I staggered back to the cabin, a mixture of fear and fury surged within me. This was my home, damn it. I wouldn't be driven off by some monster, no matter how terrifying. But even as I thought it, I knew I was lying to myself. There was no way I could stay here, not after what I'd seen. With shaking hands, I grabbed my truck keys and headed into town. I had to tell someone, had to get help, even if they thought I was crazy. The drive into Oak Ridge was a blur. My hand shook on the steering wheel, and every shadow in the trees seemed to hide that monstrous form. By the time I pulled up in front of the sheriff's office, I was a wreck. Sheriff Johnson was an old friend of Tom's, a burly man with a salt and pepper mustache and eyes that had seen too much. When I burst into his office, wild-eyed and babbling about monsters in the woods, he looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Slow down, Henry," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Take a breath and tell me what's going on." I tried my best to explain what had happened, about the creature, the attack on my cabin, and the gruesome remains I'd found. With each word, I could see the disbelief growing in Johnson's eyes. "Look," he said when I'd finished, "I know you've been through something rough, but monsters? In our woods? That's a bit hard to swallow." I felt a surge of frustration. "Then how do you explain Tom's brother?" I demanded. "He's out there, torn apart like nothing I've ever seen before." That got Johnson's attention. His face grew serious. "You found Bill?" I nodded, swallowing hard at the memory. "What's left of him?" Johnson was silent for a long moment, his brow furrowed in thought. Finally, he stood up. "All right, Henry, we'll check it out. But I'm warning you, if this is some kind of sick joke—" "It's not," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "God, I wish it was." The ride back to my cabin was tense. Johnson had called in a couple of deputies and a local doctor to accompany us. I could feel their skeptical eyes on me, could almost hear their thoughts. They thought I was crazy, or worse, that I had something to do with Bill's disappearance. As we pulled up to the cabin, I felt a chill run down my spine. The place looked different in the harsh light of day, the destruction even more evident. Johnson and his deputies approached cautiously, hands on their holsters. But when we reached the spot where I'd seen Bill's remains, there was nothing there. No body, no blood, not even a scrap of clothing. I stood there, mouth agape, as Johnson and his men searched the area. "I don't understand," I muttered, my mind reeling. "It was right here, I swear it was right here." Johnson's face was grim as he turned to me. "Henry, there's nothing here. No body, no signs of a struggle, nothing." I could see the doubt in his eyes, in all their eyes. They thought I was lying, or worse, that I'd snapped. I tried to explain about the creature, about the claw marks and the destruction inside the cabin, but my words sounded hollow even to my own ears. The doctor, a kind-faced woman named Dr. Reeves, approached me cautiously. "Henry," she said gently, "I think you might be suffering from some kind of stress-induced hallucination. Why don't you come back to town with us? We can get you some help." I wanted to scream, to make them understand that I wasn't crazy, that there was something out there in those woods. But as I looked at their faces, I realized it was useless. They would never believe me, not without proof. As Johnson and his deputies conducted a half-hearted search of the surrounding area, Dr. Reeves tried to coax me into going back to town with them, but I couldn't leave. Not yet. Whatever that thing was, it was still out there. and I had a sickening feeling that it wasn't done with me yet. In the days that followed, a search party was organized. Despite their skepticism, the disappearance of Tom's brother couldn't be ignored. Cops, hunters, and volunteers from Oak Ridge combed the woods, looking for any sign of Bill or the creature I'd described. I went with them, of course. Part of me wanted to find the creature, to prove to everyone, and maybe to myself, that I wasn't crazy. But another part, the part that remembered those glowing eyes and that twisted, almost human face, screamed at me to get as far away from those woods as possible. We followed the tracks as best we could, deeper into the forest than I'd ever ventured before. They were easy enough to spot once you knew what to look for, massive and misshapen, leading us on a twisting, nightmarish path. As daylight began to fade on the third day of searching, a sense of dread washed over the group. We were in the creature's territory now, intruders in a domain that belonged to something ancient and malevolent. It was Zeke, a grizzled old mountain man who'd lived in these parts his whole life, who spotted it first. He pointed to a hollowed-out log up ahead, his weathered face pale in the fading light. "There's something in there," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Everyone froze. I heard the unmistakable click of safeties being disengaged, the metallic echo sharp in the cool evening air. I held my breath, waiting for the inevitable, for that monstrous form to come bursting out of the log, all claws and matted fur and rage. But nothing happened. After what felt like an eternity, Zeke moved forward cautiously, his rifle raised. He peered inside the log, then let out a curse that hung heavy in the air. Inside, we found the remains of a deer, freshly mangled in that same brutal way I'd seen before. But it was what we found next to it that turned my blood to ice, tucked into a side pocket of a tattered backpack, as if placed there with horrifying precision, was a human hand, severed at the wrist. I recognized the ring on one of the fingers. It had belonged to Bill. Terror rippled through the group. This wasn't just a predator we were dealing with. It was something else entirely, something that killed not for food or survival, but for sport. Something that was playing a sick game with us. Some of the volunteers bolted right then and there, making a break for the relative safety of town. I couldn't blame them. Part of me wanted to run too, to leave these cursed woods behind and never look back. But I couldn't. Not yet. Whatever this thing was, it had to be stopped. And somehow I knew that I was the only one who truly understood what we were up against. As night fell and we made our way back to Oak Ridge, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves seemed to carry the promise of teeth and claws and that terrible, twisted face. We stumbled into town long after dark, weary and shaken to our cores. The folk who'd stayed behind stared at us with wide, fearful eyes, desperate for news but afraid of what we might tell them. There wasn't much to say. How could we explain the horror we'd seen, the palpable evil that now stalked the woods they'd called home for generations? In the days that followed, more disappearances were reported. Hikers, the occasional unlucky hunter, even a couple of kids who'd wandered too far from home. Each time the searchers would turn up nothing but scraps of clothing and those same massive misshapen tracks. The fear in Oak Ridge was palpable. People started locking their doors at night, something that had never been necessary before. Parents kept their children close, and the woods that had once been a place of beauty and solitude became a no-man's land, avoided at all costs. Through it all, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was somehow my fault, that by coming to these woods, by disturbing whatever fragile balance had existed before, I had awakened something that should have remained dormant. One night, about a week after our grisly discovery in the woods, I woke to the sound of scratching at my door. My blood ran cold as I reached for my rifle, my heart pounding in my chest. But when I opened the door, rifle at the ready, there was nothing there. Nothing, that is, except for a small scrap of paper nailed to the door frame. On it, scrawled in what looked disturbingly like dried blood, were two words that chilled me to my very soul: "Come alone." I knew then that the endgame had begun. Whatever this creature was, whatever sick game it was playing, it was time for a final confrontation. And I had a sickening feeling that only one of us would walk away from it. The decision to go into the woods alone was both the easiest and hardest I'd ever made. Easy, because I knew it was the only way to end this nightmare once and for all. Hard, because I knew there was a good chance I wouldn't be coming back. I left a note for Sheriff Johnson, explaining where I'd gone and why. I didn't expect him to believe me, not really, but I hoped it might at least point them in the right direction when things went wrong. As I stepped into the forest, rifle in hand and pack on my back, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool night air. The woods were eerily silent, as if every living thing was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. I walked for what felt like hours, following a path that seemed to appear before me and vanish behind me. The deeper I went, the more the forest changed. The trees grew taller, older, their branches twisting into shapes that seemed almost deliberate, almost mocking. Finally, I emerged into a clearing I'd never seen before. In the center stood an ancient oak tree, its trunk easily 10 feet across, and there, perched on one of its massive branches, was the creature. In the pale moonlight, I could see it clearly for the first time. It was even more horrifying than I remembered. Its body was a patchwork of fur and skin, as if it had been stitched together from different animals, and possibly humans. Its face was a twisted parody of humanity, with eyes that glowed with an intelligence that was terrifyingly familiar. "You came," it said, its voice a guttural growl that somehow formed words. "I knew you would." I raised my rifle, trying to keep my hands from shaking. "What are you?" I demanded. The creature tilted its head, an almost curious gesture. "I am what I need to be," it said. "A predator, a nightmare, a god." "You're a monster," I spat. It laughed then, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. "Monster, god. The line is thinner than you think, Henry." The use of my name caught me off guard. "How do you know who I am?" The creature's mouth twisted into what might have been a smile. "I know everything about you, Henry. I've been watching you since the day you arrived. You're different from the others. You see me for what I am." "And what's that?" I asked, my finger tightening on the trigger. "The truth," it said simply. "The truth that your kind has forgotten. That nature is not kind, that the world is not safe, that there are things in the dark that hunger." As it spoke, it began to change. Its form shifted and twisted, becoming more human-like with each passing second. Soon I found myself staring at a mirror image of myself, albeit one with eyes that glowed with an inhuman light. "You see?" it said, now with my voice. "I am you. I am everyone. I am the darkness that lives in all of you." I fired then, the sound of the shot echoing through the clearing. The creature, my doppelganger, stumbled back, a look of surprise on its face. But there was no blood, no wound, just a small hole in its chest that quickly closed up. It laughed again, a sound that was equal parts amused and disappointed. "Oh, Henry, did you really think it would be that easy?" What followed was a nightmare beyond anything I could have imagined. The creature attacked with a speed and ferocity that was inhuman, shifting forms with each blow. One moment it was me, the next it was Tom, then Bill, then shapes I couldn't even comprehend. I fought back with everything I had, emptying my rifle, then resorting to my hunting knife when the bullets ran out. But it was like fighting a shadow, a nightmare made flesh. For every blow I landed, it seemed to grow stronger, feeding off my fear and desperation. As dawn began to break, I found myself backed up against the ancient oak, battered and bleeding. The creature stood before me, once again in its original monstrous form. "It's over, Henry," it growled. "You fought well, but in the end, the darkness always wins." As it lunged for me, time seemed to slow down. In that moment, I saw everything clearly. The truth behind its words, the nature of the evil I was facing. And I knew what I had to do. With the last of my strength, I ducked under its claws and plunged my knife not into the creature, but into the trunk of the ancient oak behind me. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The creature let out a scream that shook the very earth, a sound of rage and pain and fear. The tree began to wither and die before my eyes, its bark turning black and falling away in chunks. And as the tree died, so did the creature. It thrashed and howled, its form twisting and melting like wax under a flame. I watched, transfixed, as it slowly dissolved into a black ichor that seeped into the dying earth. When it was over, I found myself alone in the clearing. The once mighty oak, now nothing more than a withered husk. The silence was deafening. broken only by my ragged breathing and the slow return of bird song. I don't know how long I sat there trying to process what had happened. When I finally found the strength to stand, I noticed something carved into the dead trunk of the oak, a message left behind by the creature in its final moments. The darkness never dies. The journey back to Oak Ridge was a blur. I vaguely remember stumbling into town, covered in blood and babbling about monsters and ancient trees. I spent the next few weeks in the hospital, recovering from my injuries and trying to convince myself that it had all been some kind of fever dream. But deep down, I knew the truth. The nightmares that plagued my sleep, the way the shadows seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. They were constant reminders of what I'd faced in those woods. The official story was that I'd had some kind of mental breakdown, exacerbated by the stress of the recent disappearances. Will's body was never found, nor were any of the others who had vanished in those woods. The searches were eventually called off, the cases filed away as unsolved mysteries. I couldn't stay in Oak Ridge after that. The whispers, the sidelong glances, the barely concealed fear in people's eyes when they looked at me. It was too much. So I packed up what was left of my life and hit the road. I've drifted ever since, never staying in one place for too long. Cities are my refuge now, the noise and bustle a shield against the memories that haunt me. But even here, in the heart of civilization, I can't escape it entirely. Sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, I think I hear it, that low, guttural growl carried on the wind. And in the shadows cast by streetlights and neon signs, I catch glimpses of shapes that shouldn't exist, that can't exist. They say time heals all wounds, but they're wrong. Some scars run too deep, some experiences change you in ways that can never be undone. The creature in the Oregon backwoods may be gone, but its legacy lives on, in the nightmares that wake me in a cold sweat, in the way I flinch at unexpected shadows, in the knowledge that the world is far stranger and more terrifying than most people could ever imagine. And sometimes in my darkest moments, I find myself wondering, did I really defeat it that night in the clearing? Or did I simply become a part of it, carrying a piece of that ancient darkness with me wherever I go? The truth is, I'll never know for sure. All I can do is keep moving, keep running from the shadows of my past and hope that someday, somehow, I'll find a way to leave the darkness behind for good. But deep down, I know better. Because if there's one thing I learned in those Oregon woods, it's this. The darkness never truly dies. It just waits for its moment to rise again. Spring 1998. The crisp, damp air of the Pacific Northwest filled my lungs as I stepped out of my old pickup truck. The familiar scent of pine and damp earth brought back a flood of memories, childhood hunting trips with my father, lazy summer afternoons spent fishing in the nearby creek, and the comforting warmth of the cabin's fireplace on cold winter nights. I'm Wyatt, and this little slice of wilderness has been a part of my family for 3 generations. The cabin, tucked deep in the heart of Olympic National Forest, was my grandfather's pride and joy. He'd built it with his own hands back in the 50s, a testament to his craftsmanship and love for these woods. Now, as I stood there in the fading light of a spring evening, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of melancholy. The cabin was showing its age. The porch sagged slightly, its wooden boards soft with rot in places. The roof had sprung a few leaks during the last winter, and the whole structure seemed to lean ever so slightly to one side, as if tired after decades of standing sentinel in these woods. That's why I was here. A week of repairs and maintenance, getting the old place ready for the fall elk season. It wasn't much, but it was a connection to my past, a link to the men who'd shaped me. And if I'm being honest, it was a much-needed escape from the grind of city life. I unloaded my tools and supplies, stacking them neatly on the porch. The forest was quiet, save for the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze, and the distant call of a bird I couldn't identify. As I worked, I found myself relaxing, the tension of the long drive and weeks of city stress melting away with each swing of the hammer, each board I replaced. That first night, I sat on the newly repaired porch nursing a beer and watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The silence was profound, broken only by the crackle of the small fire I'd built in the pit out front. It was in moments like these that I understood why my grandfather had chosen this spot, why my father had continued the tradition, and why I felt so drawn to it still. Little did I know that this peaceful evening was the calm before a storm that would change my life forever. The next few days passed in a blur of physical labor. I replaced rotting boards, patched leaks, and generally tried to breathe new life into the old cabin. It was satisfying work, the kind that leaves you bone-tired but content at the end of each day. It was on the fourth day that everything changed. I'd been working down by the creek, cutting new boards to replace some of the worst on the porch. The late afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The steady buzz of my chainsaw filled the air, drowning out the usual forest sounds. That's when I heard it, a sound like branches snapping, but heavier, more deliberate. At first, I didn't think much of it. These woods were home to plenty of deer, and the occasional black bear wasn't unheard of. I kept working, focused on the task at hand. But then I heard it again, closer this time, and something else, a low, rough growling sound that sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't like anything I'd heard before, not in all my years of roaming these woods. I switched off the chainsaw, the sudden silence almost deafening. Slowly I turned, my eyes scanning the tree line. What emerged from the shadows wasn't a deer, it wasn't a bear. It was something else entirely. The creature stood a good head taller than me, even hunched over as it was. Its body was lean, almost emaciated, with limbs that seemed too long for its frame. Patchy fur covered its body, dark in most places, but streaked here and there with an unsettling blood-red color. Its head was what struck me the most. The skull seemed almost too small for its massive body, with a muzzle stretched long like a wolf's. But the eyes, God, those eyes. They were yellow, slitted like a cat's, and filled with a hatred so intense it froze me in place. For a moment we just stared at each other, me rooted to the spot with terror. The creature, its chest heaving with each breath, drool running from a mouth filled with jagged, mismatched teeth. Then it roared. The sound ripped through the air, a primal scream of rage and hunger that shook me to my core. I stumbled backward, my hands fumbling to find something, anything I could use as a weapon. My eyes fell on a fallen log about 5 feet thick old-growth timber that had probably lain there for decades. Without thinking, I turned and ran for it, hearing the creature crashing through the underbrush behind me. I vaulted onto the log, rolling over to the other side just as I felt the wind of the creature's claws swiping at the space where I'd been seconds before. I pressed my back against the rough bark, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. For what felt like an eternity, we were at a stalemate. I was trapped on one side of the log, the creature circling on the other, its yellow eyes never leaving me, drool dripping onto the moss below. I looked around wildly, desperate for anything I could use to defend myself. That's when I saw it. The chainsaw, lying where I dropped it in my panic. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was a moment of insanity brought on by fear. But in that instant, I made a decision that would haunt me for years to come. I leapt from the log, one eye on the creature, the other on the saw. The beast tensed, ready to charge the moment I moved. But somehow I made it. I snatched up the saw, yanked the cord, and the engine roared to life. I turned to face the monster, the buzzing saw held out in front of me like a shield. The creature hesitated, backing up a step, then another. Whether it was startled by the sudden noise or genuinely afraid of the blade, I couldn't say. But it gave me an opening. Slowly, I started edging backwards towards the cabin. If I could make it inside, I had my rifle. Maybe that would be enough to drive this thing away for good. I made it about 10 feet before the creature made its move. With a burst of speed that took me completely by surprise, it lunged forward. Instinctively, I swung the saw. The sound of the blade biting into flesh and bone was sickening. Dark blood splattered the leaves as the creature howled in pain, one of its arms hanging limp, nearly severed at the shoulder. For a moment, our eyes met again. In that instant, I saw something in those yellow depths that chilled me even more than the hatred had: intelligence. This wasn't just some animal acting on instinct. There was a mind behind those eyes, alien and terrifying. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the creature turned and bolted back into the woods, leaving nothing but a trail of blood and broken undergrowth in its wake. I stood there shaking for what felt like hours, the chainsaw still buzzing in my hands. When I finally managed to switch it off, the silence of the forest seemed to close in around me, oppressive and filled with unseen threats. Somehow I made it back to the cabin. I patched up the few scratches I'd received as best I could, my hands trembling the entire time. That night I sat up with my rifle across my lap, jumping at every creak of the old cabin, every rustle of wind in the trees outside. As the first light of dawn broke through the windows, I made a decision. I had to go back for the chainsaw. It felt wrong to just leave it out there, and some irrational part of my mind was terrified of someone else finding it, of having to explain the blood. I waited until full daylight, then ventured out with my rifle in one hand and a flashlight in the other. I found the saw lying in a pool of congealed blood, dark and tacky in the morning sun. I cleaned it as best I could, trying not to retch at the smell and the memory of what had happened. I didn't see the creature again that trip, but every night I lay awake listening, wondering if it was out there, nursing its wounds, waiting. When I finally left a few days later, it was with a sense of relief so profound it was almost painful. As I drove away, I glanced in my rearview mirror at the receding tree line. For just a moment, I thought I saw a flash of yellow eyes watching me go. But that had to be my imagination, right? The weeks that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and jumpy days. I'd returned to my apartment in the city, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow seemed to hide those yellow eyes. Every unexpected sound made me flinch. I told no one about what had happened. Who would believe me? I could barely believe it myself, and I'd lived through it. I was sure that if I opened my mouth, I'd be met with either laughter or concerned looks and suggestions of therapy. But I couldn't let it go. The image of that creature, its inhuman eyes, the sound of its roar, they haunted me. I started doing research, spending hours online and in libraries, looking for anything that might explain what I'd seen. Most of what I found was useless. Cryptozoology websites full of blurry photos and second-hand accounts, conspiracy theories that ranged from the absurd to the terrifying. But here and there, I'd find something that made my blood run cold. A Native American legend about a creature that stalked the forests of the Pacific Northwest. An account from an early settler describing a demon beast with yellow eyes and an insatiable hunger. Nothing matched exactly what I'd seen, but there were enough similarities to keep me digging. I became obsessed, neglecting my work, my friends, even my health in my quest for answers. It was during one of these research binges that I stumbled upon it, a dusty leather-bound book in a tiny used bookstore downtown. The Cryptids of the Pacific Northwest, the gold-embossed title proclaimed. I bought it without hesitation, hurrying home to devour its contents. Most of the book was what I'd come to expect. Bigfoot sightings, sea serpent tales, the usual fare for this kind of literature. But near the back, in a chapter on monstrous predators, I found something that made my heart stop. The Wendigo. The description wasn't an exact match for what I'd encountered, but it was close. Too close to be coincidence. An emaciated body with unnaturally long limbs. A head that seemed too small with a muzzle like a wolf's, and those eyes yellow filled with an insatiable hunger. The book spoke of the Wendigo as a creature of insatiable appetite, driven by an eternal hunger for human flesh. It was said to be created when a person resorted to cannibalism, transformed by their heinous act into a monster that could never be satisfied. As I read, memories of that day by the creek came flooding back. The raw, animalistic hunger I'd seen in those eyes, the intelligence behind them, the way it had hesitated when confronted with the chainsaw, showing a level of reasoning beyond that of a simple beast. I slammed the book shut, my hands shaking. It couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of coincidence, my mind making connections that weren't there. And yet, I never went back to the cabin after that. I told myself it was because I was too busy, that I'd outgrown the need for that kind of solitude. But deep down I knew the truth. I was afraid. afraid that every rustle in the wind, every flicker of movement at the edge of my vision would be that creature returning. I sold the cabin a few years later, told myself it was time to let go of the past, to move on. But even as I signed the papers, I felt a twinge of guilt. Was I abandoning my responsibility, leaving others vulnerable to whatever was out there in those woods? The years passed. I tried to move on, to forget, but every now and then something would happen that would bring it all rushing back. A news story about a missing hiker in the Olympics. A hunter who vanished without a trace, or worst of all, reports of mutilated animal carcasses that authorities couldn't explain. Each time, the nightmares would start again. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, the echo of that inhuman roar ringing in my ears, the memory of those yellow eyes burning in my mind. I told myself it was over, that I'd escaped, that the creature, whether it was truly a Wendigo or something else entirely, was gone. But deep down in the darkest corners of my mind, a voice whispered that it wasn't over, that someday, somehow, our paths would cross again. And when that day came, I didn't know if I'd be ready. 20 years, that's how long it had been since that day in the woods. 20 years of trying to forget, of building a new life far from the shadows of the Olympic National Forest. I'd moved to the East Coast, thrown myself into my work, done everything I could to put the past behind me. But you can't outrun your demons forever. It was a Tuesday when the letter arrived. Just a simple envelope, unremarkable except for the return address. A P.O. box in a small town not far from where my old cabin had stood. I recognized the handwriting immediately, even after all these years. Ethan, my old neighbor from up near the cabin. We hadn't spoken since I'd sold the place, had barely kept in touch even before that. But there was an urgency to his scrawled words that set alarm bells ringing in my head. With trembling hands, I opened the envelope and began to read. Wyatt, I hope this letter finds you well. I know it's been a long time, and I'm sorry to bother you out of the blue like this, but something's happening up here, something I can't explain. And I don't know who else to turn to. It started a few months ago. Livestock going missing, then turning up torn apart in ways that don't make sense. My neighbor's dog disappeared, then showed up on their porch the next day, half-eaten. And the sounds, Wyatt, the sounds in the woods at night. I know how this must sound, but I remember the stories you used to tell, the things you said you saw that summer before you left. I didn't believe you then. I'm sorry for that, but now I think I understand. Please, Wyatt, I need your help. Something's out there, something that shouldn't exist, and I'm afraid it's only a matter of time before it comes for us. Ethan. I stood there in my kitchen, the letter shaking in my hands, memories I'd spent 2 decades trying to bury coming rushing back. Part of me wanted to crumple the paper, toss it in the trash, and pretend I'd never read those words. To tell myself that Ethan was imagining things, that there was a rational explanation for everything he'd described. But another part of me, a part I'd tried so hard to silence over the years, knew better. I remembered the promise I'd made to myself in those sleepless nights after my encounter. If I ever saw evidence, real evidence, that the creature was back, I wouldn't run, I wouldn't hide. I'd hunt it down. With a sigh that felt like it came from the depths of my soul, I reached for my phone. It was time to book a flight back to Washington, back to the forests that had haunted my nightmares for 20 years, back to face the Wendigo. The flight to Seattle felt like it took an eternity. Every mile that brought me closer to the Olympic Peninsula seemed to wind the tension in my gut tighter. I'd packed lightsome clothes, basic supplies, and my old hunting rifle. I'd had to jump through some hoops to bring it on the plane, but there was no way I was heading back into those woods unarmed. As I drove the winding roads towards Ethan's place, memories flooded back. The smell of pine and damp earth, the way the mist clung to the trees in the early morning, and always the memory of yellow eyes watching from the shadows. Ethan was waiting for me when I pulled up. He looked older, worn down by worry. The easy smile I remembered was gone, replaced by a tight-lipped grimace. We didn't hug, didn't trade jokes. There was no time for that, not with the creeping dread that seemed to hang over both of us like a shroud. "Thanks for coming, Wyatt," Ethan said, his voice low and gravelly. I wasn't sure you would. I nodded, shouldering my bag. Wasn't sure I would either, but here I am. We went inside, and over cups of coffee that grew cold and forgotten, Ethan filled me in on what had been happening. The stories were chilling. Livestock torn apart, pets disappearing, strange tracks found in the mud that didn't match any known animal, and always the sounds in the night, howls that were almost human but twisted into something terrible. I thought I was going crazy, Ethan admitted, his hand shaking slightly as he set down his mug. But then I remembered the things you used to talk about, the creature you said you saw. I closed my eyes, fighting back the flood of memories. I hoped I'd never have to think about that again, I said softly. But I guess some things don't stay buried. As night fell, we made our plans. In the morning, Ethan would take me to the places where the worst incidents had happened. We'd look for signs, try to piece together what was going on, and then, well, we'd cross that bridge when we came to it. That night, as I lay on Ethan's couch trying to sleep, I could hear the wind howling outside. And in that wind, I could have sworn I heard something else. A cry of hunger, a promise of violence to come. The hunt had begun. Dawn broke cold and misty over the forest. Ethan and I set out early, our breath fogging in the chill air. He led me to the first site, a clearing where one of his neighbor's cows had been found, or what was left of it. The grass was still matted and stained dark in places, despite the weeks that had passed. I crouched down, examining the ground closely. There were tracks, but they were like nothing I'd ever seen before. Too large for a wolf or a bear, with claw marks that gouged deep into the earth. Jesus, I muttered, running my fingers along the edge of one print. What could have done this? Ethan just shook his head, his face pale. That's not even the worst of it. Come on. We spent the rest of the morning moving from site to site. Each one told the same story, violence beyond anything natural predators were capable of. At the last stop, the site of a hunter's abandoned campsite, I found something that made my blood run cold. Caught on a low-hanging branch was a tuft of fur, dark, almost black, but streaked through with that sickening blood-red color I remembered all too well. Ethan, I called, my voice shaking slightly. I think we have a problem. I showed him the fur, explained what it meant. His face went ashen. So it's real, he whispered. The thing you saw all those years ago, it's back. I nodded grimly. Looks that way, and I think it's hungry. We made our way back to Ethan's place in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. As we approached his cabin, I noticed something that made me stop in my tracks. The door was ajar, swinging slightly in the breeze. Ethan, I said softly, reaching for my rifle. Did you leave that open? He shook his head, his eyes wide with fear. Slowly, carefully, we approached the cabin. I took the lead, pushing the door open with the barrel of my gun. The interior was a disaster. Furniture overturned, claw marks gouged deep into the walls, and there on the floor was a set of tracks leading from the back door out into the woods. The same massive clawed prints we'd seen at the attack sites. It's been here, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. It's hunting us now. Ethan's face was a mask of terror. What do we do? I checked my rifle, making sure it was loaded. We end this, tonight. We spent the rest of the day preparing. I cleaned my rifle, making sure every part was in perfect working order. Ethan dug out an old shotgun he kept for home defense. We gathered supplies, flashlights, extra ammunition, first aid kit. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, we set out into the gathering darkness. Our plan, if you could call it that, was simple. We'd set up in the clearing where Ethan said he'd heard the creature most often. With any luck, it would come to us, drawn by our presence. And then, well, then we'd see if bullets could do what my chainsaw hadn't 20 years ago. The moon was a thin sliver in the sky, casting just enough light to make the shadows seem alive. We huddled by a small fire, more for comfort than warmth. The woods whispered and creaked around us, and every time the wind gusted, I found myself jumping at shadows. Hours passed. The fire burned low. Ethan dozed fitfully, his shotgun clutched to his chest. I remained vigilant, my eyes scanning the tree line, my ears straining for any sound out of place. And then, just as I was beginning to think we'd made a mistake, I saw them. A pair of yellow eyes reflecting the moonlight, slinking into view at the far end of the clearing. "Ethan," I hissed, shaking him awake. "It's here." The creature moved like oil on water, fluid and wrong. It froze when it seemed to sense us, that elongated head twisting from side to side, sniffing the air. My heart was a jackhammer in my chest as I raised my rifle. "Wyatt," Ethan whispered, his voice trembling. "Don't." But it was too late. I fired, the blast shattering the stillness of the night. The creature roared, a deeper, angrier sound than I remembered. It lunged forward, a blur of tattered fur and teeth. I stumbled back, fumbling for another shell, firing again and again. The gunshots seemed to drive it into a frenzy. It didn't retreat, didn't slink back into the shadows as any normal animal might. Instead, it charged straight towards us, propelled by rage and a hunger beyond my comprehension. Ethan's shotgun roared, the blast catching the creature in the shoulder. It staggered but didn't fall. I fired again, saw blood spray from its flank, but still it came. "Run!" I shouted, shoving Ethan towards the trees. We bolted, terror lending speed to our legs. I could hear it gaining, its snarls echoing through the forest. I stumbled, fell hard, rolled to my feet just as it reached me. I swung the rifle like a club, catching it on the side of its head. The blow sent it staggering back a step, buying me precious seconds. I scrambled deeper into the woods, branches whipping at my face. I'd lost sight of Ethan in the chaos. All I could do was run and pray. Finally, lungs burning, legs screaming, I collapsed behind a tangle of old-growth roots. I crouched there, gasping, listening. For a moment, all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. Then a twig snapped nearby. I held my breath, finger on the trigger of my rifle. Slowly, I raised my head, peering over the roots. There it stood, not 10 feet away. In the pale moonlight, I could see it clearly for the first time. It was even more horrifying than I remembered. Patches of fur missing, revealing gray, leathery skin underneath. Its face was a nightmare of mismatched teeth and those burning yellow eyes. And there, on its shoulder, was an old scar. The mark left by my chainsaw 2 decades ago. Our eyes met, and in that moment I knew. This wasn't just about hunger anymore. This was personal. It had been waiting all these years for me to return. With a roar that shook the very air, it leaped. I raised my rifle and fired again and again, until the click of the empty chamber echoed in the night. The creature crashed into me, its weight driving me to the ground. Claws raked across my chest, teeth snapped inches from my face. I fought with everything I had, knowing that if I faltered for even a second, it would be over. Just as I felt my strength giving out, a blast rang out. The creature's head jerked to the side, dark blood spraying from a wound in its neck. It roared in pain and fury, momentarily forgetting me. Ethan stood there, his shotgun still smoking. "Get up," he yelled. "Run." I didn't need to be told twice. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the pain from my wounds, and ran. Ethan kept pace beside me, pausing every few yards to fire another blast at the pursuing monster. We burst out of the tree line into a familiar clearing, the same one where we'd started this insane hunt. Our campfire was still smoldering, casting a feeble light. "The car," Ethan gasped. "We need to—" His words were cut off as the creature exploded from the underbrush, slamming into him with terrifying force. They went down in a tangle of limbs and fur, Ethan's screams piercing the night. I looked around wildly, desperate for anything I could use as a weapon. My eyes fell on the campfire, on the half-burned log still glowing with embers. Without thinking, I grabbed one, ignoring the searing pain in my hand. I charged forward, swinging the makeshift torch like a club. The burning wood connected with the creature's face with a sickening thud. It reared back, howling in agony, paws clawing at its burning fur. I struck again and again, driving it back from Ethan's prone form. The creature's howls turned to whimpers, then to a low, keening sound that was almost human in its anguish. It backed away, those yellow eyes never leaving mine, filled now with something I never expected to see, fear. With one last baleful glare, it turned and fled into the darkness of the forest. I stood there, chest heaving, the smoldering log still clutched in my blistered hands. Slowly, I turned to where Ethan lay. "Ethan?" I called softly, moving to his side. "Ethan, can you hear me?" He groaned, stirring weakly. Is it gone?" I nodded, helping him to sit up. Yeah, it's gone, for now at least." We made our way back to the cabin, supporting each other, both of us battered and bloody but alive. As we stumbled through the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The Wendigo was still out there, nursing its wounds, its hatred. And someday, somehow, I knew we'd meet again. But for now, we had survived. And in the world of monsters and men, sometimes that's the best you can hope for. #. Epilogue. The endless hunt months have passed since that night in the woods. Ethan's recovering, slowly but surely. The official story is that we were attacked by a bear. It's easier that way, simpler. Who'd believe the truth? I've moved back to the area, rented a small cabin not far from where my grandfather's old place used to stand. I tell myself it's to keep an eye on things, to be ready if the creature ever comes back. But deep down I know the truth. I'm waiting. Watching. The hunter has become the hunted and the game is far from over. Sometimes on those long dark nights when the wind howls through the trees, I swear I can hear it out there. A low, keening cry of hunger and hate. A promise that someday, somehow, we'll face each other again. And when that day comes, only one of us will walk away. Until then, I keep my rifle close, my eyes on the tree line. Because out there in the vast wilderness, in the shadows between the known and the unknown, the Wendigo is waiting. And so am I.